The chain link gate's icy metal stung through my gloves as I leaned against it. A raw breeze swept in from the harbor, laced with the sharp scent of salt water and the distant pulse of music echoing from the base. Beyond the checkpoint, Fort Shatton hummed with life. Officers in crisp dress uniforms wove between illuminated buildings, their laughter fading into the dark. I'd once tread those same paths, year after year. Now I stood on the outside. The guard's gaze swept over me, from my boots to my collar, pausing just long enough to conclude I was a stranger. "Sir, do you have an invitation?" His tone was clipped, routine. I had something better. A black access card rested in my palm, its edges biting into my skin beneath the glove. Not a standard pass, something far more exclusive. I held off revealing it. Not yet. "Lucas!" A sharp, familiar voice cut through the night. My brother stepped from the shadows of parked cars, his navy dress blues impeccably tailored, the silver insignia on his lapel glinting under the floodlights. Matthias halted a few steps away, his eyes narrowing. "You're not on the guest list. This is Father's birthday, a formal military affair, not whatever you've been up to since you left." Since I left? As if Kandahar had been a fleeting whim. As if a decade of orchestrating supply lines under gunfire and managing airlifts in blackout zones was just a footnote. He crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips, cold and distant. "Don't complicate this. We've got admirals, defense contractors, and top brass inside. This is for people who still matter to the Navy." The guard's eyes darted between us, his hand hovering near the ID scanner. I caught the faint scent of my father's cologne, crisp, woody notes that always evoked parade grounds and staged photos. Before I saw him, Clara Vogel stepped into the circle of light, her silver cufflinks gleaming like polished coins. "Lucas," she said, her voice low but razor sharp. "I told you this morning not to come. This night is for your father. Don't make a scene." Beyond them, the honor guard marched into the hangar, dress swords flashing under the floodlights. I recognized two of them instantly, men who'd served under my logistics command in the Indian Ocean. They hadn't noticed me yet. I adjusted my grip on the duffel bag at my side. The black card pressed harder into my palm, a silent reminder of its weight. I met Matthias's gaze, my voice steady, measured. You have no clue how close you are to learning exactly where I stand." My father's voice cut through the breeze, precise as ever, the tone she used for directing staff or photographers. "I told you, Lucas. It's better for everyone if you stay away. Tonight isn't about you. Your father's reputation is on the line here, and I won't have it undermined." The word undermined hit harder than she realized. I'd spent years in conflict zones ensuring supply chains, convoys, and lives weren't compromised. Yet here I was, told my presence at my own father's celebration was a risk. Matthias stepped forward, as if on cue. "I made senior counsel last month," he said, voice smug like he was reading a press release. "And just last week, I joined the Strategic Advisory Board for Falcon Defense. It's a role for those shaping military policy, not the ones who used to haul crates on deployment." His eyes flicked to my boots, pointedly. I kept my expression neutral. Falcon Defense had been in my secure briefing room 2 months ago, pitching a deal they desperately needed my approval for. My approval. Father's gaze shifted past me to the hangar entrance. "Do you even know who's here tonight?" she said, her cufflinks catching the light as she gestured subtly. "Admiral Klaus Ritter, commanding the Atlantic Fleet, General Stefan Holt, whose family's influence spans generations, and Emil Braun, the financier who practically funded the Navy's new destroyer program." I let her list them, each name a thread tied to my desk at the Pentagon. Ritter had been in my classified logistics briefing 3 days ago. Holt's procurement deal was awaiting my signature. Braun's bank, I'd halted one of their financing proposals last quarter, pending compliance. They didn't know, and in their ignorance, they spoke freely, sketching a world they thought I'd abandoned. The guard shifted, sensing the tension but not the history. Inside the hangar, the brass band struck a note, the music drifting out like a challenge I was meant to ignore. I adjusted the duffel strap on my shoulder, the black card pressing into my palm again, a reminder I didn't need their permission to pass through that gate. Not tonight. Their words hung in the air, heavy as the damp harbor breeze, but they weren't new. I'd heard them before, sharper and more private. 10 years ago, at 27, when I told my father I was leaving the Naval Academy for deployment in Kandahar, he didn't shout. He didn't need to. "No son of mine," he'd said, standing in the kitchen in full dress uniform, "will serve as a grunt just to die in some forgotten desert." I was young enough to think courage alone could outweigh his disapproval, that proving myself on the front lines would earn his respect. Kandahar shattered and reshaped me. I'd hauled munitions under rocket fire, mapped convoy routes over IED-laced roads, coordinated evacuations in sandstorms that turned day to night. I'd held my breath calling in air support, knowing one wrong coordinate could cost lives. When my body finally gave out under the weight of gear and years, I wasn't sent home. A sealed order moved me to a windowless ops center in Virginia. The work shifted. Satellite feeds replaced dust, encrypted briefings replaced shouted commands, eventually the Pentagon, strategic planning, my signature on billion-dollar defense projects, my clearance higher than most of the names my family dropped, but to them I was still the boy who ditched the academy for a soldier's wage, a veteran scraping by on some modest pension holed up in a Navy-subsidized flat. They never asked. They didn't want the truth. I'd learned silence was simpler than convincing them. Let them see a smaller version of me. It kept my real work hidden, my networks unseen. Power I'd found thrived in the gap between what people assumed and what they could never confirm. But that night, at the gate, hearing Matthias recite his titles and my father list her guests, something stirred. I wasn't 27 anymore, and I wasn't here to shield their misconceptions. The black access card in my hand felt heavier now, not just a key, but a testament. I'd forged a career they couldn't fathom, and tonight, I was done hiding it. I shifted my stance, boots crunching on the gravel. For a moment, I considered walking away, letting them have their night undisturbed. I'd done it before, driven off without a word, telling myself it wasn't worth the battle. But then a voice from years ago pierced the haze in my mind. Colonel Dietrich, my first commanding officer in Kandahar, the man who showed me the difference between following orders and leading. Rank's worthless if you can't stand for yourself when it counts. He'd said it after I'd taken the fall for a logistics mix-up that wasn't mine, just to keep the peace. I'd thought it was noble. He'd called it letting others script my story. Not tonight, not again. I tightened my grip on the duffel, fingers grazing the cold edge of the black card. This wasn't just about entering a celebration. It was about stepping into a space that had declared me irrelevant and showing them exactly whose ground they stood on. From the shadows beyond the gate, a low engine growl broke the quiet. Headlights cut across the tarmac, catching the pristine white of the Navy banners strung above the hangar doors. A sleek, black, armored SUV pulled up beside me, its reinforced panels gleaming under the floodlights. The driver's door swung open, and Lieutenant Colonel Felix Brandt stepped out, broad-shouldered, eyes keen, the kind of man who only grinned when the job was done, and even then, sparingly. He'd been my anchor through missions we still couldn't discuss in the open. Together, we'd walked out of places erased from maps, carrying intel that reshaped conflicts. "Sir," he said, voice sharp but quiet, his glance flicking briefly to my father and brother before settling on me, "your table's ready inside." It was more than a courtesy. It was a declaration. I drew a breath, the old discipline settling over me like a second skin. The gate remained shut, the guards still waiting, but my decision was made. I wasn't leaving. Tonight the silence broke. Felix's voice cut through the chilly air like a blade. "Herr Director, the minister's conference room is set inside the base." For a split second, no one stirred. The title landed heavy and unyielding, slicing through every murmur, every sidelong glance. The guard blinked, processing, then snapped to attention with a salute so precise it could have been etched in steel. "Sir," he said, voice now formal, "welcome back to Fort Shatton." The gate's metallic groan as it slid open felt almost staged. I stepped forward, Felix at my side. The faint tang of jet fuel and harbor salt drifted in. My father's hand, which had rested so casually on Matthias's arm moments before, tensed. Matthias's face paled. "Director," he echoed, the word alien on his tongue. He'd always been so sure my career had ended in Kandahar's dust, never imagining I'd emerged from those deserts to wield authority over global military logistics and strategy. I didn't look at them yet. I didn't need to. Their silence spoke volumes. Inside the hangar, transformed into a ballroom, the shift was immediate. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Then, like a tide turning, the room's most decorated figures gravitated toward me. Admiral Klaus Ritter, whose operations I'd personally authorized, General Stefan Holt, whose deployments hinged on my rapid response supply chains, Emil Braun, the financier who'd faced me in classified briefings, his eyes sharp over sensitive proposals. Each shook my hand with a grip that signaled respect, not pleasantries. From the corner of my eye, I saw Matthias watching, his certainty unraveling. My father's smile was rigid, fraying at the edges. I kept my face calm, letting the moment unfold as it should. They'd said I didn't belong. Tonight, the base itself had answered. The introductions settled into a low hum of recognition, and for the first time that evening I let myself pause, letting the room's weight settle where it belonged. Matthias's gaze burned into me, sharp as a blade, his mind racing to rewrite every assumption he'd held about my life. He didn't have to wait long for the first fracture in his narrative. So Matthias, Admiral Ritter said, voice casual, I hear your firm is finalizing that deal with Falcon Defense Systems. Matthias straightened, seizing the moment. Yes, we're very proud. It's a significant milestone for us. I let the silence linger just long enough before I spoke. That contract's on my desk. My team will decide if it proceeds. The shift was palpable, a flicker of disbelief, a tightening of his jaw. One sentence, and the hierarchy he'd clung to for years, was rewritten. I moved through the crowd, met by salutes, nods, and quiet acknowledgments. Every conversation seemed to circle back to me, not because I demanded it, but because every thread of influence in that room ran through my office. The Fort Shatton expansion, General Holt said, is a masterpiece. Whoever's behind it deserves praise. I met his eyes. You're standing in it. My department designed every phase, every wing, every logistics upgrade. My signature's on the plans. From the side, Emil Braun approached, his smile polite but pressing. Herr Director Vogel, we're awaiting clearance for the loan on Project Nacht. Your approval is critical. I nodded once. We'll review it post-audit. Nothing moves without oversight. It wasn't about gloating. I didn't need to. The truth did the work. The same people who dismissed me minutes ago now gravitated toward me with a new energy, respect, necessity, and a quiet recognition of where the real power lay. Across the room, my family stood frozen in their corner, watching the current they thought they controlled shift toward me, and I didn't need to raise my voice to make it happen. The room had changed, but some currents ran deeper than politics or contracts. I saw my father across the hall, standing slightly apart from the rest. The same man whose voice had once roared over my choices, whose silence had stung sharper than any battlefield command. As he approached, his steps were slower than I recalled, as if the weight he bore tonight wasn't his age, but the years of distance between us. He stopped before me, his gaze steady, unguarded. I owe you an apology, Lucas, he said softly, for every time I called your path a mistake, for not seeing who you've become. For a moment, I thought of countless nights in desert outposts, staring at unyielding stars, wondering if he'd ever take pride in me. But pride wasn't what I'd chased all these years. I don't need your forgiveness, Father, I said, voice level. What I needed was your respect. I've earned it, whether you gave it or not. His jaw tightened slightly, not anger, not quite regret, but acknowledgement. It was enough. I reached into my jacket and drew out a sealed envelope. Happy birthday, I said, placing it in his hands. He frowned, that familiar crease forming before questions, and opened it carefully. Inside were transfer papers for the historic military estate in Virginia, the one he'd spoken of for decades but could never claim. I had it restored, I added. Every stone, every timber. It's yours now. The air between us held still, but not cold. For the first time, we stood on equal footing. I had no desire to dominate or prove superiority. This wasn't about settling scores. It was about closing a chapter on my terms. He looked at me, eyes softer now. Thank you, Director Vogel. Not son, not boy, but but a title carved from strategy, sacrifice, and resolve. That meant more. The clink of glasses and murmur of voices resumed, but the room's energy had shifted entirely. I was no longer on the fringes of the gathering. I sat at the center table, flanked by Admiral Klaus Ritter and General Stefan Holt, both leaning in to discuss upcoming defense strategies. Across from me, Emil Brown spoke of banking channels we'd refine for the next phase of global initiatives. The irony was stark. Minutes ago, I'd been told I wasn't welcome. Now, the table my family deemed beyond my reach was one I'd been shaping for years. Matthias kept his distance, his smile stiff and fragile, murmuring to an aide as if trying to salvage his faltering Falcon contract. It wouldn't clear. Not through me. Not now. My father, meanwhile, had already begun rewriting history. I overheard him telling a cluster of guests, "I always knew Lucas had this in him. He's just quiet about his work." A convenient narrative for the night. I didn't challenge it. Some fights aren't worth the effort, and I'd already won the one that mattered. As the speeches tapered off and the evening drew to a close, I stood, shaking hands with those who'd been my allies long before my family knew their names. Felix waited by the SUV, its engine humming, the military emblem on its side catching the light from the hangar's entrance. I stepped outside, the cool night air settling on my skin like a final mark on the evening. The gates of Fort Shatton loomed ahead, and I recalled the guard's stern face, my family standing there, barring my way. Now, those same gates parted without pause. I hesitated before climbing in, glancing back at the building, the faint echo of laughter fading behind its walls. This table I'd built myself, and no one would ever pull my chair away again. The door closed with a firm click. Felix eased forward, the base's lights shrinking in the rear view, but the quiet satisfaction held steady, as constant as my own pulse.